watch was one of the meetings was not recorded, and it was a live in-person meeting. So that's why it was nearly all, but not all 50 hours. But the main highlights have basically been, these meetings have been a wide range. They've been long and short. They've gone some 30 minutes, some almost 2 hours. There's been witnesses that have given a wide range of testimony. They've, when they first started these meetings, several witnesses encouraged lawmakers to sort of delay these hearings because there wasn't an adequate public notice, right? So you saw relatively few public engagement, or at least witnesses able to testify at some of the earlier meetings. Towards the end, you saw some more, and then at the very end, it kind of dropped off public participation. The messages have ranged from everything from encouraging lawmakers to be transparent, a reminder and sort of renewed calls to take the redistricting process out of lawmakers' hands, which has been a topic of discussion in the state for several years now. And then, of course, there's also been calls from groups like MALDEF and the Latino Policy Forum and several others who have essentially said, don't divide our communities and certain parts of the state, right? So there's really big concern about having sort of district lines drawn down maybe certain neighborhoods it might be in one community, or separating an entire city, in ways that would sort of water down their interests. Of course, some witnesses have also said that they need better representation, that the 2011 remap did not necessarily incorporate them as much as they would like to see. And overall, a lot of witnesses have raised concerns about Democrats' apparent plans to finish the remap before June 30th. Democrats, we can get into that a little bit later, have targeted that date because essentially it would, after that deadline, it would be removed from the legislative hands and sort of handed to this separate committee. So a relatively few number of witnesses have endorsed that plan overall.
Very good. You've talked about a number of two different groups that have testified during these committees. Was there any specific group that has stood out, or has we saw come to numerous meetings over time?
So by my count, there were about 200 witnesses. I'm still going through and adding all the names and subtracting people to not have repeats, but it's somewhere around 200 witnesses. And you saw some local elected officials, including a couple of Chicago aldermen. You saw some folks who haven't even taken office yet, like Evanston Mayor Daniel Biss. But you also saw a lot of organizations like the Mexican American Legal Defense and Education Fund. You've seen Common Cause, Change Illinois has been at repeated ones, the League of Women Voters, and the Illinois Muslim Civic Coalition has played a prominent role, or at least during the beginning and the early or middle hearings. Of course, there's been tons of random citizens, people just calling in. One of the big concerns is that a lot of them have been during the 9 to 5 hours. And so people have to work. People aren't all paid journalists, lobbyists, representative from organizations. So you've seen some people literally call in from a convenience store where they're working. Some people watching their children play in the background on a playground. There's some meetings have had very little, like 0 participants and just written testimony. Some have had a dozen or so witnesses. With the only main difference between the House and the Senate hearings have largely been the House has had sort of a 5 to 10 minute presentation at the start of them from a House staffer, just kind of giving an overview.
Well, on that note about what the various different parties have been saying at these hearings, what have Democrats and Republicans said during these redistricting hearings and the overall process?
So for Democrats who are leading the process, because they have the supermajority in both chambers, they've essentially vowed to be transparent and open and said that this has been a more engaging process than in previous years. They've pointed to the significant increase in the number of hearings compared to 2011. They've also said both leadership and rank and file members have said they want this process to be to result in a, quote, fair map that reflects the diversity of the state. Democrats have said that by going past the June 30th deadline essentially would be very undemocratic. And that deadline is sort of key because it essentially takes the entire map making process and winnows it down to a separate committee, which would then be tasked with coming up with the remap. If that committee doesn't come up with it, it would literally go to a process where a name is drawn out of a replica of Abraham Lincoln's stovepipe hat, which Democrats say is not democracy at all. Republicans, on the other hand, have really been sort of pushing and prodding their Democratic colleagues for a myriad of answers. They've asked simple things like what sort of data will be used to more complex ones, more process stuff. They've also questioned how Democrats can sort of change their tone on supporting an independent process and now move forward with this plan. You've also largely seen Republicans leading the question of witnesses, oftentimes asking witnesses to elaborate on some of their comments, but potentially set themselves up for using witness testimony as a way of getting some Republican concerns out there. And that's largely been, you know, again, the message on both. You're oftentimes not hearing Democrats listen to Republicans, Republicans listen to Democrats. Kind of some of this infighting has often occurred.
Have we seen different messaging from the governor?
The governor has largely stayed out of the process. He has, during the beginning of it, he said, of course, I would veto any unfair or partisanly drawn map. In 2018, when he was running for governor, he pledged to veto any map drafted or created by lawmakers. But more recently, he drew Republicans' ire because he said essentially that the state didn't adopt a constitutional amendment to essentially have an independent redistricting process, and therefore he would basically follow what the plan is with Democrats, which is to finish a map by June 30th. Republicans have said that that's a flip-flop. Democrats have basically, I think, given the okay that sounds good to them.
Well, I appreciate you giving us a quick breakdown of the last 50 hours of these committee hearings. I want to remind our guests that if you do have any questions, feel free to drop them in the chat, and we'll try to get to them towards the end of the call. But Joel, why don't you take it from here and talk to our guests?
Sure. So for those watching right now, we have two guests. One is Kent Redfield, who is a professor emeritus of political science at University of Illinois at Springfield. And we also have Griselda Vega Samuel, who is from MALDEF, who I've mentioned a few times, the Mexican American Legal Defense and Educational Fund. So we'll start with Kent. So Kent, you've been watching these redistricting hearings for a long time, to say the least, right? So for those who are unfamiliar, can you kind of give a summary of the process for the redistricting steps in Illinois and some of the key deadlines to watch out for?
Okay, and you've already touched on the outlines of this. It's set by the 1970 Constitution, and essentially it keeps the redistricting process within the legislative process for the first half of the year. So up until June 30th, if the legislature passes a map and the governor signs it, then that becomes the redistricting for the next 10 years. It's a bill. It's a piece of legislation that has a 10-year lifespan. The hope was that you would either, through the process, you would get either a majority in it working its will, which is what happened in 2011, or if you got a gridlock, if you had two chambers in different hands, governor, a different party than the legislature, then the hope was that you would get compromise. And they put in some features to try and promote compromise. So if you blow the June 30th deadline, then the process immediately shifts to an 8-member commission. Now it's still controlled by the legislative leaders. These are, each of the 2 leaders appoints a legislator and another another member. So it's a 4-4 partisan split. But the hope was that, given a smaller group, you might get a compromise. That worked once. In 1971, they didn't get a map. They went to the Redistricting Commission and they got a compromise, which has to be agreed to by 5 of the 8 members. Now, that has to happen by the 10th of August. If that does not happen, then the next incentive they put in there was essentially a doomsday mechanism, so that if you didn't have a map with that 8-member group, then the Supreme Court would put forth 2 names, 1 Democrat, 1 Republican, and you would draw a name out of a hat. Hasn't always been a hat, but the first time it was a hat. Then whoever was the winner of the lottery would have a partisan majority and be able to enact a map. And you have to remember through all of this that whoever controls the process does not have any constraints on their ability to draw a map that gives them maximum partisan advantage. And so the thought of the 1970 Constitution is no one would be crazy enough to risk 10 years of elections on drawing a name out of a hat. That's exactly what we've did for the next 3 times. Democrats won the lottery, then the Republicans won the lottery, then the Democrats won the lottery. Then 10 years ago, the Democrats controlled the whole process. So it certainly has not worked the way they intended. And because the state constitution only talks about districts being contiguous, compact, and substantially equal in population, there really are no guidelines in terms of exactly how you go about drawing a map. You certainly have constraints from federal law and Supreme Court decisions, but it is a process that is the legislature is always part of the process, but you could end up with the Republicans with very small, super minorities in both the House and the Senate controlling the process if we ever got that far.
So you sort of alluded to it earlier, but for decades, the remapping process has been led by some key players in Illinois, including former House Speaker Mike Madigan. This year, obviously there's been leadership change, including in the Senate. We have a new Senate president, and how would that change in leadership, in your estimation? How does that change the redistricting process from previous years?
Well, certainly these are inexperienced leaders, and 2 of them went through the remap process in 2011, where a partisan majority controlled it. 2 of them have never been through a redistricting process. So, when you had Mike Madigan and to a lesser extent John Collerton, you had people that had been through more than one remap process. So this is a very inexperienced group in terms of negotiating a map. Plus, you do not have the speaker with the extraordinary power that he exercised and the support that he had of very powerful interest groups to mediate, to control, to negotiate. But clearly the biggest difference aside those 2, which are huge, is the fact that we do not have the official census data and will not have it before the 30th of June.
Yeah, expand on that a little bit more. What does that do with the process now?
Well, and clearly the Constitution does not say you have to use the official census data. The only time it mentions the census is in it specifying the year in which redistricting must take place. So it is clear we're not going to have official data. It becomes a political problem for the majority. If they do not get a map by the 30th of June, they give up control of the process. If they pass a map based on community survey data, based on most recent estimates, whatever basis that they do it, then they will have complied with the process. they will have passed a map that's been signed by the governor. Now, it may violate all sorts of things in terms of federal voting rights or even the state constitution in terms of substantial population, but passing a map then short circuits the redistricting commission. You can't get to, that's self-actuated. You only got so many days to appoint that commission, and you can only do that if the legislature has failed to pass a map. So there's huge incentive for the Democrats to pass some kind of map, because then everything else becomes litigation against their map rather than trying to get to the redistricting process.
One of the biggest differences between this year's remap and the 2011 one is sort of this growing movement to take away the redistricting process from lawmakers, right? You've seen that in Illinois, you've seen that in other states that it's been successful. While it hasn't been successful here, do you think that might change? Could this be the last sort of legislative-led remap if those, efforts continue and there's a sort of growing chorus of calls for that?
I wish I could be more optimistic about that. This is an issue that is only important once every decade for a couple of years. And it's very difficult to amend the state constitution through citizens initiative and to write something that will pass constitutional muster. So you're back to the majority giving up power, which historically legislatures have been very reluctant to do. And so without something, if you got a major change outlawing partisan gerrymanders, maybe that would loosen up the conversation. But this has been, I've been through this for 4 or 5 maps now, and we talk about it a lot, but somehow we never get there.
I wanted to turn to you, Griselda. Griselda Vega Samuel from MALDEF, the Mexican American Legal Defense and Education Fund. You've testified in several of these hearings. I've seen your testimony. Illinois was one of 3 states to experience population loss in the last decade, according to the new census data. At the same time, the state's Latino population has seen a significant increase, which your organization has noted during these redistricting hearings. In your view, how should the various population shifts be reflected in a new map?
So from the MALDEF position, any and all increases or shifts will be detailed in that census redistricting file that Kent mentioned that we won't get until September. So that file is the only data source that can accurately show us to the block level detail where that Latino community has increased and shifted to. And so we really need to wait for that information to ensure that we have an accurate reflection of where people have moved to and where, what the growth has been. We looked at the apportionment data, and what we can see is that if it wasn't for the Latino community's growth, that is what saved the second, Illinois from losing a second congressional seat. Now, through MALDEF's work with our partners, we've heard from that the Latino population has been moving to the collar counties outside of Chicago, which has been a trend for the last several decades. Now, as we look at the maps and we're redrawing lines, whether it's congressional, state, or county, that population growth needs to be reflected in those lines. And if that means that there's an increase in Latino majority districts or influence districts, then these new maps should be in line, more importantly, with the Federal Voting Rights Act, because we need to make sure that we're protecting the minority voting rights.
So in an ideal world, how many majority Latino districts would MALDEF like to see in the new maps? Do you guys have any recommendations, or are you still sort of waiting out and seeing either what lawmakers do, with their proposal or for this data?
Well, given that our position currently is that the ACS data is not it can't be the data source to be used, MALDEF will not speculate on the number of Latino majority districts, since we don't have that PL file. So we have to wait to September to make sure that we get the accurate number reflected of Latinos in Illinois.
I mentioned this. Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
I mentioned it earlier, you know, the concerns about dividing communities. Can you sort of explain that to people that haven't tuned in? What's the worry if, let's say, you know, you have a district in Chicago and you cut a line right down a Latino community? What is the big concern about that?
So, I mean, the biggest concern is that with any remapping or redrawing of lines, it is in the community's interest to stay together. I mean, the reason that communities need to stay together so that they can vote for an elected official of their choosing that will best reflect and represent their interests. Now, who can understand the community best if it's, unless it's someone who is from that community, who like can be responsive, who can advocate on their behalf and make sure that the community gets the resources that they need to raise and protect their families. I mean, I think when we start talking about remapping, one of the biggest examples is back at the yards in Chicago. I mean, that community is divvied up into 4 different districts. And they have consistently, I mean, every time I go into that community, they consistently complain that they want to be with their neighbors and that it's really hard because one neighbor has to call one representative for something and then the other one doesn't get their snow removed and the other one doesn't get garbage pickup. And so it's those very important day-to-day things that we take for granted, that those are the things that our representatives that we choose is, you know, that's why it's important that you get to choose whoever is going to best reflect your community and your interests.
And it sounds like that's not just a neighborhood sort of concern, right? Like, while one may think dividing a community in Chicago, that may logically just come to mind, but it's also some of the outer areas where there are large Latino populations outside of the city that have those same concerns about the divisions of communities, right?
Absolutely. I mean, you know, we're hearing from, community members outside of the county as we're starting to go into these, different communities that we haven't traditionally been in, that stuff like language access is important, right? Like, I want to participate in my local, community board meeting and I need a translator, or I want to be able to go talk to, the school board and, I need that language access. Or, we're growing into a community that, has a crime issue. So who do I talk to? Like, all of those things are important because as a community, you're working with each other to make sure that you're getting responsive feedback for whatever needs you may have. To make sure that your school has, different language access or, different gifted programs. You want to be able to, access that for your family. Those are all the things that, again, are important for communities to be able to engage in and to be able to access.
I've got another question for you, but just a reminder, if anybody has questions, feel free to enter them in the chat. We are going to take those here in a couple of minutes. So Griselda, every remap leads essentially or inevitably to a legal challenge. What are some of the things that might cause your organization and others to sort of challenge a new map in court?
So, of course, we're concerned with anything other than the census data being used for remapping. And, when you don't use that decennial census information that has that level of detail, you run into a very high likelihood that there's going to be an undercount of not only the Latino community, which is what we expect if the decennial census information isn't used, but also an undercount of other underrepresented communities, whether that's the African American community, the Asian community, the MENA community, which you mentioned earlier. I mean, all of those communities have to have, we need this very, very detailed information. And so ACS simply doesn't provide that information because they're estimates and it's based on a really small sample size.
What else should people know about about MULDEF as the ongoing redistricting process continues here?
So, the last thing I'll mention that not only is, the use of ACS data very concerning because we believe that any use of that information will likely be in violation of the Federal Voting Rights Act or even the Illinois Voting Rights Act. So that, as Kent has mentioned, it's likely going to be a lot of litigation that goes on. So we definitely are expecting that. But, I think ultimately the people need to know that redistricting does have a direct impact on the effectiveness of your vote, right? On the sort of your daily life. And so to be able to have responsive elected officials and the policies from your local government that affect those day-to-day decisions is really important. So we really urge people to participate in the redistricting process, to be able to share those thoughts. As you've mentioned, one of our biggest complaints during our testimony has been that process, while they claim to be transparent, hasn't been very transparent. I mean, holding a meeting on a Tuesday at 2 o'clock is not transparent to most people. As you've said, not all of us are getting to work from home or have the time to schedule a meeting, but people need to be able to have a say about where that line is going to be drawn, whether it's a block over or a block, to the left or to the right, because it's going to break up their community. So we really encourage people to speak up and reach out to your legislators and let them know that they want to participate in this process. I think it seems, the legislators have sort of wanted to make redistricting seem like this really complicated process, which technically it ends up being. But at the front end, it is their responsibility. We voted them in. So they owe us to be able to hear us and to listen to our concerns. And so that complicated process shouldn't be done behind, closed doors, as we all saw last week. So your voice matters, and you need to reach out to your legislators and let them know that you have something to say and that this is important to you.
Griselda, if I may, real quick, I did get a direct message question asking, were there any specific neighborhoods within the city boundaries that, within the county of Cook that is under a threat of being divided?
So again, right, we haven't made official comments, mostly because we don't have the data files to actually be able to accurately assess that. What we know is that there was some counties last go around in 2010 that were sort of on the cusp of becoming Latino majority districts up in Lake County. But we don't know, and we don't know what we don't know. So we need to wait for that PL file that comes out in September or late August, for those that have fancy software to deal with the data, to really see where those numbers have shifted and grown.
Well, I do want to offer you both an opportunity to have some final thoughts in our last few minutes here. Griselda, any final thoughts here for us?
Again, really, I think from our perspective, we just want to make sure that any map that gets drawn needs to be in compliance with the Federal Voting Rights Act and the Illinois Voting Rights Act, and that we're protecting minority voting rights. And because of, specific to the Latino community, that increase in our community's growth and shift is going to be really important. And so we can't make those assumptions until we get that file. And so any map that is in violation of that will likely invite litigation, and people need to be prepared. But by the same token, people need to speak up and need to be engaged. I mean, I will say one more time, both the House and the Senate have put up these portals, not very user friendly. So people are really going to need to engage to be able to, actually have their voice matter. But as Kent also said, we are going to be with these maps for the next 10 years. So think about what impact that's going to have on you and your family, where you live, if you don't speak up now.
And to your point, Griselda, the map deadline is today. So if the public has a submission for the map idea, it's got to be in today, and it's very confusing. As somebody who uses a lot of government websites, I don't have any idea how to use that. Kent, one last question for you. Griselda obviously highlighting some of the potential for the legal process to play out here, and inevitably that will, but what role do courts play in this redistricting process?
Well, my expectation, I mean, they always play a role in terms of litigating, have you complied with the criteria or the process? And so, is the district compact, or have you met the deadlines? Those, and so there's always that kind of litigation. I think in Illinois, the potential is going to be that we're going to get a map that's going to be based on something other than census data, so that the Democrats will retain control of the process. And then we're going to litigate that map. And it's going to be up to the state Supreme Court, once we have the census data, to go back and decide what is the remedy. Can the legislature fix it? Are they going to take alternative maps? And so I think the state Supreme Court is going to play a huge role in terms of the final map that we're working with, because I think, the Democrats would be committing, tremendous, political malpractice to lose control of the process. And at the moment, because they have not asked the Supreme Court to move the deadlines, the only way they control the process is to get a map that complies with the process. The legislature voted for it, the governor signed it, the Constitution doesn't say you have to use census data. And then, once we have the census data, it's going to be let the lawsuits begin in terms of trying to take that map and get to something that actually complies with, where we ought to be. It's a mess. Part of the reason we're in the mess is because we have a March primary. That means you're supposed to be filing petitions, collecting petitions in October and filing them in December. So, we crunch up against our election calendar on top of that. This is just, I don't see any good way that this is going to end until we finally get the data and get a map in front of the Supreme Court that you challenge, and then figure out how are we going to resolve this in terms of getting something that meets the various legal qualifications that you have to have in terms of having a valid map.
Well, as we look to wrap up here, this week and maybe potentially next week, it sounds like are going to be crucial. I'm hearing that there may be new maps already. The legislature wants to get done with the session by the end of this month. So that really kind of gives a sort of nearing deadline for them, especially if they want to offer public comment of these final proposed maps, which has been a resounding message. But I want to thank both Kent Redfield, Griselda Vega Samuel. Thank you guys for participating in this. We will continue to be in communication with you as this process continues to play out. So appreciate your participation and your thoughts.
Happy to be here.
Well, thank you everybody for joining us today on this webinar here, Unwinding the Map. Please join us again in the future. You will see notices on our website and in our newsletter. If you haven't signed up already, you can do so at thedailyline.com. We have a new website. Please check it out. I also would give you all a heads up to keep an eye out for our Q2 Chicago Index that is going to be coming out in within a month. I would love for you guys to all participate. You can register as a panelist at thechicagoindex.com. Thanks so much, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your day. Appreciate you joining us here for this lunchtime conversation. Bye-bye.